this is Michael Portillo. Later in the programme, we're going to be discussing appeasement, the policy of Neville Chamberlain to give ground to Hitler in the hopes of avoiding war. That's on the back of a new film, Munich, The Edge of War. I'll be talking to the director and to an historian. Delving further into the past, Professor Alice Roberts will be on the programme to talk about her many series of Digging for Britain, the latest of which has just been screened. And the greatest exhibition ever of the portraits, self-portraits I should say, of Vincent van Gogh will be held at the Courtauld, and we'll be discussing what the self-portraits tell us about that tortured man and genius. Well, Robbie Millen, the literary editor of The Times, is back in the studio with me to talk about his book selections. And we begin with the book The Georgians, The Deeds and Misdeeds of 18th Century Britain by Penelope Corfield. So, the Georgians, this covers much of the 18th century, and indeed strictly it ought to go up to 1830 with the death of George IV. And the more I think about it, the more it is a very interesting period. Does your reviewer think that it's been done justice?
Yes, it has. I mean, Penelope Corfield's a decent historian, and as you say, this is although it says the deeds and misdeeds of the 18th century, it's very much taking a very liberal view of what the century is. So I think it starts from a bit of Charles II onwards to the first few years of Queen Victoria's reign. And I think it's the most exciting period in British history. It's that kind of rollicking moment where we sort of we become British for starters, so we have more of a sense of us as a British people. The sort of Victorian sort of morality isn't set in, so everyone's having lots of fun. It's a very kind of Borisian age, very Boris-like. Everyone drinking too much and squiring and not worrying about affairs and such like. And it's a sort of also a period of sort of incredible growth. The country becomes very wealthy. We start enjoying rum and sugar and things like that. And obviously there's a dark side. We get that sugar and that rum through slavery and such like. But it's just one of those periods of real ferment and excitement.
It's a very interesting period because simultaneously it is one of expansion in the sense that the British Empire is pushing outwards. Absolutely. On the other hand, of course, we lose the colonies in what is now the United States. It is the period in which the first industrial revolution in the world occurs. You talk about the liberality of society. On the other hand, someone like Horatio Nelson, as I was discussing on this programme last week, could not reveal that he was having an extramarital affair and indeed had an illegitimate child. Had that been revealed, it would have been fatal, I think, to his career. So we can perhaps overstate that point. But anyway, fascinating. I'm quite interested to dwell for a moment on slavery because, obviously it's a topic that we're all interested in. I'm wondering how she deals with it. One tends to say, slavery was the morality of the day. Ethics were different in those days. Racism was taken for granted. Of course, white people thought they were superior to black and all that sort of thing. But, of course, that theory is slightly marred by the fact that there were Quakers and others who were strongly opposed to slavery and pointed out the immorality of the system. How does that emerge in the book?
Well, so it's a bit of a mixed picture. So, for instance, in our review, Andrew Taylor mentions Mad Jack Fuller, who was the owner of estates in both Jamaica and also property in Essex. And he sort of blithely believed that the conditions of his slaves in the West Indies were much better than British workers. And he clearly sort of properly seriously believed it. And then, of course, these sort of human beings do like their comforts. And obviously it was, our ancestors rather liked having lots of rum and sugar. I mean, obviously, this was a great craze for sugar, putting it in your tea, which again was a relatively recent thing. So there was a kind of a poem which mocked this sort of desire for our coziness off the back of slaves. So I pity them slaves greatly, but I must be mum, for how could we do without sugar and rum? And it's a sort of a ditty by William Cowper. And then, but obviously, you're right, the Quakers were campaigned. And obviously, this is the era when we first sort of see the arrival of the novels. And the novel is a great device for sort of trying to make us think about other people and what they're thinking. So we've got something like Lawrence Sterne, the great novelist, sort of looking at the tint of. There's a quote about him becoming interested in human skin colours and say, which tint of these is it that the ties of blood are to cease? So again, sort of trying to see beyond the skin colour. And actually, we illustrate this review with a wonderful Hogarth picture from his Marriage à la Mode set. And, of course, there are two black people in it. One's a servant delivering some, I think it may be a cup of tea. And then we got a small child who's, I assume, probably sort of rather unfashionable, being used as sort of a fashion item almost. But so it's interesting that, the story is very much more complex.
Very interesting. The book that we've been discussing is called The Georgians, The Deeds and Misdeeds of the 18th Century, of 18th century Britain by Penelope J. Corfield. Now, a book that probably I would find slightly less interesting.
Surely not.
What Do Men Want? Masculinity and Its Discontents by Nina Power. Now, the book asserts, I believe, that masculinity is in crisis. So my first question would be, does the book prove that it is? And if it is feminism in crisis too, given the advance of the transgender agenda? Well, maybe rather answer the first question.
I know, actually, my eye first rolled when this book arrived in. I thought, oh, another one of these sort of chin-stroking books, which sort of asks, what is the future of something very abstract? And you think, oh, God, not another one. But this book is actually very interesting. Okay. I've been reading it this morning, and every sort of few pages, I've sort of been underlining things, because Nina Power is such an interesting writer. She's not someone I've sort of ever read before, but she's sort of, I think, sort of a rogue feminist philosopher. So what she's done is she wants to get beyond all that sort of boring talk of toxic masculinity and manspreading and mansplaining, and say, well, men and women exist. They, obviously have different bodies. The sexes, the two sexes, she's quite firm on that, do exist. So how on earth do you sort of create some kind of society where they can live alongside each other? And she actually comes up with some things which sound very conservative. She's very keen on society rediscovering masculine virtues. So things like courage, virility, honour, loyalty and such like. So it's an unexpected book, because I think she's probably a woman of the left. But I think you were right to bring up the issue of trans. I think that's one of those subjects which has made a lot of feminists think, well, if men and women do exist, if I believe in sex rather than gender, what other thoughts flow from that? So I think it's one of those really interesting books. I really recommend it.
Okay.
So you were wrong to be sceptical on this occasion.
Well, we've discussed before how blurbs can put you off. And what I'd read was, Nina Power unlocks the secrets hidden in our culture to enable men and women to practice playfulness and forgiveness and reach a true mutual understanding and a lifetime of love. Can you blame me?
I know, it's terrible. I suspect the publishers were a bit nervous of what they had here. This was a book saying interesting things, which sort of went against the kind of the soft liberal orthodoxy. So
the publisher has disguised the jewel very well. What Do Men Want? Masculinity and Its Discontents by Nina Power. Now, Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy by David Chalmers. And this appears to be about virtual reality. And the author argues that virtual reality and reality will become indistinguishable from one another, and that virtual reality is more than just escapism. Is that broadly the thesis?
That is indeed. Well, it's one of those books which I don't know whether a lot of your listeners have ever watched any of those Matrix movies, where the whole plot revolves around people living in they're actually preferring to live in a virtual reality than the real world and such like.
Is that what it was about?
Exactly.
I had no idea what it was about when I saw it.
I don't want that to be a plot spoiler. So there's this he's an Australian philosopher who lives in the States. He's basically making the case that the digital world is as real as the physical world of the plastic I'm touching, the wooden head I'm touching. And one of the questions he asks, is it possible that the world we're living in right now is a computer simulation? I know. We ask all the big questions. And he says, actually, it's quite likely that we are living in someone else's computer simulation. We think we're real and free will and all that kind of stuff. But no, we're all made up. Because he takes the work of another philosopher called Nick Bostrom, who says, if you look at the computer processing on an average laptop, you can now simulate whole universes. What's to say, over time, enough people can be doing that therefore we're not in one. Once you think like that, you think the processing power of laptops are amazing now. If you've got a really good one, you could create a virtual world.
I suppose so. I think this goes back to a widely shared insecurity. I mean, I've often had this thought. I had this thought long before computerization. Do I really exist? Is this all?
Yes.
Is this all imaginary? If I shut the door in a dark room, does the table and the chair in that dark room, do they continue to exist, or have they disappeared? All right. Reality Plus: Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy by David Chalmers.
So if the previous book was a chin stroker, this one's a head scratcher.
Head scratcher, very good. A wooden head scratcher. I do want to get on to this one because this sounds most interesting to me. The Ticket Collector from Belarus, an extraordinary true story of Britain's only war crimes trial by Mike Anderson and Neil Hansen. Now, this is about Zion Bluestein and Andrei Savonyuk, who were childhood friends in the 1930s in Domachevo, which is now in Belarus. But they later became bitter enemies and they confronted each other in the Old Bailey because Andrei Savonyuk was accused of war crimes at a concentration camp. And I understand that the story of these two turns out to be most remarkable.
It is. I mean, first of all, I'd forgotten that, or maybe didn't even know, that only one person in Britain has ever been prosecuted successfully for war crimes during the Second World War. And the person, the only person found guilty is this man, Antoni Szewniuk, who was actually a retired ticket collector at London Bridge Station, just around the corner from us, British Rail employee. But back in Eastern Europe, at various stages, he'd served with the Waffen SS, but he had engaged in, mass murder. I mean, in the end, he was charged with was found guilty for 18 particular murders, but there were probably hundreds. He was one of these sort of auxiliaries that the German forces use, and he seemed to be a very willing and unrepentant accomplice. So this book tells a story it's sort of partly a kind of legal thriller, telling us a bit about how the law changed, their confrontation in court, but it does also go back to what exactly happened in Belarus, and it leaves also the question that in the Soviet archives, when they're having a look around, they found 97 suspected war criminals that had been believed to have been domiciled in Britain. This was evidence that the Russians had collected.
Did David Aronovich, who reviewed it for you, think it was a good book?
He did, yes.
So you recommend it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's not exactly a cheery read, but it's kind of important to remember. I always think it's those books which just go through the details and remind us exactly what happens. And it's just rare that we get cases that have gone to court and have that kind of level of evidence.
And we have achieved, as usual, our aim of talking about the Nazis.
I know.
We seem to do it just every week. And by the way, we're going to be talking about the Nazis again shortly because we're going to be talking about the new book about the Munich Agreement of 1938. Did I say book? I meant film. I'm just looking at a photocopy of the Times here. On the 10th of January, you produced a list of books which were meant to lighten up the most dismal days. What did you have in mind?
So it's a mixture of 10 comfort reads, which my colleague Melissa Katsoulis pulled together. And then I'm always seeking laughter. So I chose 10 funny books. And there are quite a mix. Some are kind of just books that are very cheerful. I think, I'd say anybody who's got a sort of intelligent teenager, if that teenager's not read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, they ought to. I reread it recently after a gap of 30 plus years. It's still really funny. And the things he predicts, or artificial intelligence and things like that, predicts robots with personalities. Unfortunately, personalities are a bit depressive. You know, excessively cheerful opening doors and things like that because of, giving technology person. So that's one I would definitely recommend. Perfect for these dark days.
Douglas Adams died terribly young. It's
Oh God,
it's horrific to think, how much we lost with his death.
Absolutely superb. I remember my teenage years were made so much better by reading all of his books.
The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was actually published back in 1979 by Douglas Adams. Robbie Mullen, thank you so much for coming in once again. Alice Roberts is a biological anthropologist, biologist and television presenter and Professor of the Public Engagement in Science at the University of Birmingham. She's now hosted 9 series of Digging for Britain on BBC Television, which visits archaeological sites in Britain where noteworthy discoveries have been unearthed. The latest series has recently been broadcast and is now available online. Alice Roberts joins me this evening. Welcome to Times Radio.
Thank you very much, Michael. Lovely to be here.
Good, and congratulations to you on 9 series.
Thank you.
Can you give me some idea of how much archaeological excavation is going on in the United Kingdom? I'm wondering, is it difficult to find enough dramatic discoveries to fill a series of 6 one-hour programmes, as you have done?
Yeah, actually it's not, which is incredible. And I think that Digging for Britain must be the only BBC series that gets commissioned on the basis of not knowing what is going to be in the programmes. And I think the first 2 series, or in fact the first series, I remember the commissioners being quite nervous about that because, we had to say to them, we can't tell you, we can't come and give you a treatment and tell you exactly what's going to be in each programme because we honestly don't know. And then what's astonishing is that every year we've been able to fill up those programmes with lots of discoveries. And in fact, we have such a wealth of different excavations, different finds, that it's an embarrassment of riches. I mean, we're kind of sorting through, and it really is the best stories that make it into those 6 programmes this year.
And why is it then that so much digging is going on in Britain?
Well, the vast amount of digging that's going on in Britain is construction-led archaeology, developer-led archaeology. So that is the majority of excavation, and that is professional field archaeologists, professional units. And what I'm really pleased with this series because we've been able to work with a lot of those big units this time. Sometimes it's quite difficult. There can be difficulties with access. There can be difficulties also actually in knowing what the story is going to be because those developer-led excavations are prospective. You literally don't know what you're going to find, and sometimes you don't find anything. Sometimes you find something absolutely spectacular. So I think it's quite important to have those in the series because it shows the breadth of British archaeology, that it's not just university research digs, but it is also this professional archaeology which is allied with preparation for construction and development. But also, actually, I think sometimes, and I hesitate to say this because the university digs are amazing as well, but sometimes you get the best stories out of those developer-led digs because you get the real revelations. A completely unknown Roman town in North Somerset that you wouldn't have gone to look for because there's just no suggestion from ancient maps, from any documentation that there's anything there. And it's only because those archaeologists were digging those fields, making sure that the fields are ready for cable laying for the national grid, that they found this Roman town. So you get great stories.
What is the purpose of archaeology?
Well, that's a good question. The purpose of archaeology is to provide evidence about the ancient past, and it's a very, very different discipline from history. So I think it's really important to say that it's not there to illustrate history. And of course, what archaeology does is allow us to explore the past before history as well. So it's the only means that we have of understanding human prehistory. Archaeology is about human culture, human material culture. And I think that in terms of, that's the kind of function of it. So we're exploring the past through the material culture of our ancestors. Why do we do it? We do it because we want to understand ourselves better. We want to understand history better. We want to understand who we are in the here and now. And part of that is that history and our background. It's how we came to be. It also holds up a really interesting mirror to the present as well. I think you can look at different ways of doing things. You can look at different ways of subsisting, different types of economies, different types of political systems, and so it's quite expanding. I think it gives you, in that way that travel does. The way that travel encourages you to look at your own culture, your own society in a different way. Archaeology again holds a mirror up to us and shows us different ways of being.
Excellent answer. I was very struck by the discovery shown in the first episode of your latest series of a large Roman mosaic in a farmer's field. And let's hear a clip about that.
Can I kneel down on here?
Yes. Oh, well.
Oh my goodness.
That,
it's just there.
It is right under the surface. So,
oh, look at that. That's amazing.
So, the shield of the shield bearer.
This curving around here?
Yeah, that is his shield running into the border here.
Okay, so his face is going to be just here?
Yeah, it is. It is fabulous, isn't it?
Oh my goodness, this is amazing.
You can look them in the face. It's, you don't get to do that very often.
That is the face of a Trojan?
Yes. So this ought to be Priam with a bit of luck. So...
my heart is racing.
Yeah, amazing.
Just amazing.
Hang on.
Look at that.
That's Priam's face. There we go.
Oh, there he is.
There's his Phrygian cap, because he is the king of Phrygia as well as the king of Troy. You just don't want to stop uncovering it, do you?
No. Oh, Jim, I'm quite emotional seeing this. It's just amazing. I feel incredibly privileged to be here to help begin to uncover it. Nobody's seen those faces for perhaps 1,600 years. It's mind-blowing.
A clip from Digging for Britain, Alice Roberts uncovering a Roman mosaic depicting the battle between Hector and Achilles in the Trojan Wars. Alice, I own a property in Spain where I have been lucky enough to discover Roman mosaics. I was very struck that the farmer who made the find was enthusiastic about it, despite the fact that his field would be hugely disrupted by the arrival of archaeologists. And I just wonder, are homeowners and landowners generally keen to facilitate excavation? You mentioned earlier developers, you talked about, putting down power cables, but presumably those developments are delayed while the archaeology is unearthed.
Well, usually they're not delayed because the archaeology is built in from the beginning. So archaeology is part of the planning process. And I think it's really important. It is part of the planning process. We certainly don't want people bulldozing through important heritage in the British landscape. And I think that we all want our heritage to be respected. And so I think that archaeology as part of planning is really important. There's been a consultation about archaeology in planning recently, and I think it's really important to say that archaeology very, very rarely stops planning applications. So it's a tiny percentage of planning applications. Of the planning applications that get turned down, it's a very, very tiny percentage of those that are turned down on the basis of archaeology alone. And on the other hand, what we see is that we are protecting and preserving our heritage by archaeology being part of the planning process. And if it's done well, it's not really delaying because you anticipate what's going to be there. Sometimes it does. I mean, that cable laying, they expected the archaeology to take a few weeks, and it took a couple of years. So it can slow things down, but I think you can't just bulldoze away a Roman town because you want to quickly lay a cable. We are the latest people to inhabit this landscape, and we have to respect those who went before.
Yes, I mean that's obviously said from your particular perspective. I mean, it's my perspective too, but I would say that when my wife and I discovered our mosaics in the house we were redeveloping in Spain, everyone told us that that was a catastrophe because it would delay our building works by years.
How did you feel about it, Michael?
Oh, I felt extremely excited by discovering these
Yeah,
mosaics,
yeah.
and they're preserved as part of the house now.
I mean, my goodness, that's, it
But
makes your house so special.
it does. But many of my neighbours there would say that they would just want to cover over anything that they discovered in private property because of the inconvenience of getting involved with the civic bureaucracies. And that takes me to a point. What are the obligations on people in Britain if they make a discovery?
It's obviously different for developers and construction work and individuals. I mean, there is if you find something, and if an individual person is out walking and finds something on somebody else's land, you absolutely have to tell the landowner, and also you should tell the Portable Antiquities scheme as well. So we have this wonderful scheme in Britain, which is based in museums, and there are portable antiquities schemes officers all over the country. So they're easy to contact. Just Google them, you find the website, and there's a great video on the website actually about what to do in terms of if you find archaeology. If you find human remains, you have to call the police because they could be relatively recent and not as old as you think they are, and you need to make sure that they are old before anything else happens. But with anything that is sort of archaeological value, then yes, it is about making sure that you've told the landowner and told the Portable Antiquities scheme as well.
I mean, just sticking with the mosaic that we've been talking about, which is a very splendid thing, beautifully coloured, beautiful depiction of Hector and Achilles. What would happen to an artifact like that mosaic? Will it simply be logged and then reburied, or will it be taken up and taken to a museum?
It's there's no definite answer to that, and it would be it depends on so many different factors. For now, that mosaic is covered up, and it's covered up really carefully according to the Historic England guidelines. So actually in the programme, what you heard me doing with Peter Liddell, that was the person that appeared in that clip, who was the senior county archaeologist for Leicestershire. We were brushing back the sand that had been placed over it from the previous year's excavation. So it had been covered up with sand, covered up with a membrane, then covered up with soil, and a whole field of wheat planted on top of it. So it was very, very safe. And we had excavated away the soil, and we were pulling back the membrane and then brushing away the sand, and then proceeding over the following weeks to actually excavate the entire mosaic. So to continue excavating and reveal all of it. It's been covered up again, and it has been scheduled. So it is now a scheduled monument, which means that it's illegal to go digging holes on it without permission from Historic England. And I think the plan at the moment for that site, because it's much bigger than just that one room with the mosaic in, it looks like a whole villa complex, and it's quite amazing for modern archaeologists to have the opportunity to excavate a large complex like that to modern archaeological standards, with all the wonderful sciences that we've now got that help us understand these sites much better than, say, even 10, 20 years ago, and certainly 100 years ago. So there are plans to keep on excavating that site, and that will be probably happening over this next summer. Jim Irvin, who is the farmer's son who discovered the mosaic, is on Twitter. I think he's on Twitter as @MosaicJim. So if you want to find out what's happening with that excavation, follow him. And I'm sure he'll be tweeting about it over the summer.
But just sticking with the example, and I'm sorry to be sort of boring about it, supposing that mosaic is not taken up and not taken to a museum, it will have been logged, it will have been scheduled.
Yeah.
It will have told us something about the lifestyle of well-off Romans many centuries ago. And just tell us why that matters, why it makes the whole thing worthwhile.
It's another piece of the puzzle. So I think the Romans I have a love-hate relationship with the Romans, actually, Michael, because we know quite a lot about them because they wrote stuff down. They wrote a lot of stuff down. I rather like prehistory because you go back into prehistory and you don't have that written word to rely on, and you just have archaeology to help you get to the bottom of the mystery. And I think there's a tendency with the Romans to think we know everything there is to know about the Romans. You know, why do we need to do any more archaeology? And it's just patently not true. We keep on finding out more about them. I mean, the site in North Somerset, that new Roman town, is really important because that will be extremely important in understanding the economics of the region. We know that the Romans were mining lead on the Mendip Hills, for instance. We thought they were probably exporting it out. Obviously, they've got to export it somewhere. We thought they were probably taking it by road to the east. This town is likely to change our thoughts about that, and perhaps, in fact, what we've got is a port on the Severn Estuary, and they are exporting their lead that way. So each new find is adding a piece to the picture, and it's not just about adding detail. Sometimes it can change it quite significantly. I mean, this mosaic was fascinating because it's clearly indicating that whoever commissioned that mosaic knew that story really, really well.
Indeed. I'm going to cut you short if I may. I've got one more story to fit in before the half hour. Professor Alice Roberts, thank you for talking to us about Digging for Britain, the BBC series which has been broadcast and is now available online. Congratulations to you again. When Neville Chamberlain died at the end of 1940, Winston Churchill, by then Prime Minister, was generous in his tribute. Quote, "It fell to Neville Chamberlain, in one of the supreme crises of the world, to be contradicted by history, to be disappointed in his hopes, and to be deceived and cheated by a wicked man. But what were these hopes in which he was disappointed? What were these wishes in which he was frustrated? What was that faith that was abused? They were surely among the most noble and benevolent instincts of the human heart. The love of peace, the toil for peace, the strife for peace, the pursuit of peace, even at great peril, and certainly to the utter disdain of popularity or clamour. Whatever else people may or may not say about these terrible, tremendous years, we can be sure that Neville Chamberlain acted with perfect sincerity according to his lights, and strove to the utmost of his capacity and authority, which were powerful, to save the world from the awful, devastating struggle in which we are now engaged. This alone will stand him in good stead as far as what is called the verdict of history is concerned." That's the end of the Churchill quote. Well, the film shares Churchill's magnanimity in that moment towards Chamberlain. Shortly, I'll discuss appeasement with an historian, but first I have the pleasure of speaking to the film's director, Christian Schwochow. Welcome to Times Radio, and congratulations to you on a gripping film.
Hello, thank you.
Was it important to you that Chamberlain should be portrayed as a man sincerely striving to avoid the catastrophe of war?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, I come from Germany, and even though the Munich conference took place in my country, it's an event where we don't know a lot about in my country. So I was fascinated in having the opportunity to tell a story about this moment in history on the edge of war, just in those months before this horrible war started, and being able to tell a story about the everyday life in this moment where the catastrophe is kind of, people could sense it, but they didn't really know what was going to happen, what will happen. And then having a politician like Chamberlain in the middle of that, who was desperate to save the world, to save his country, to save the continent. I found that striking in a way, because, I think we live in a world today where in Europe, but not also in Europe, there's more and more dictators being into power, and it's so difficult to find answers how we should deal with them. And I think Chamberlain tried his very best, and it's also always very easy to judge from today's perspective that he was naive or that he was fooled by Hitler. And the film doesn't want to create a monument for Chamberlain, but just want to give him a different kind of take, and you know, wants to raise questions like, how would we have dealt in a situation like, he found himself back then?
It's interesting that you say these events are not very well known about in Germany. The British seem to be obsessed with the war against Germany. I say that in particular because they're not particularly obsessed with the war against Italy or the war against Japan. We do book reviews on this program, and every week there's a new book about the Nazis.
Yes,
were you wary of, as it were, helping the British once more to hark back to Hitler? Did that cause you any anxiety?
Well, first of all, I mean, in Germany, we have so many books and we have so many films being made about the Second World War. But this story is not about the Second World War exactly. It's about those months before it started. So this is, the years of 36, 7, and 8. Those are the years where, there was a big build-up to the war, and Hitler was, actually quite open in what he had actually in mind and what he was planning to do, and what he was hoping to achieve. But those years are quite unknown, and that, the Munich conference is part of that. But of course, in my, when I went to high school and to university, we spoke a lot about the Second World War, but the British perspective was something very new and unknown to me. So very exciting to explore through the book of Robert Harris, and then also with my own research that I did for the film.
Your film certainly includes the defensive points that one would make in favour of Chamberlain. I mean, first of all, that of course Britain wanted to avoid war if it possibly could. The memory of the Great War was still extremely raw. The slaughter of the Great War had been appalling. It was predicted that if there was war with Germany, 600,000 people would be killed in aerial bombardment, so it was likely to affect civilians much more than any previous war. And on top of that, Britain was entirely unprepared. But rather less to Chamberlain's credit, of course, as you point out in the film, the Czechs are not invited to the Munich conference, which gives away millions of Czechs to live under the Nazis. That is scarcely thought about. The British think that they can dispose of the Czechs in that way. However, as I said in my introduction, it did buy time. So it seems to me that you do make the defensive points, and I'll be talking to a historian shortly. Worth remembering that public opinion was generally on Chamberlain's side, and even the royal family invited Chamberlain on his return, you mention it in the film, onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace, sacrificing their position of normal political neutrality.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in those days, I think Chamberlain was like the most popular politician in the world, because there was so much focus on him, and people everywhere believe that he's doing the right thing. And I mean, like I said, from today's perspective, it's quite easy to say after we know the result, and that Second World War happened and was the most terrible thing in history. We can call him naive, but I still wanted to give a feel that politics are so complicated and it's so hard to make decisions. And and the film is not only about Chamberlain. We have those two young characters, Paul and Hugh, a German and a British diplomat, and both from different backgrounds, and they discuss the opportunity of political resistance, and they have very different opinions on that, and they both try different things to interfere in what's going on. And this is, the whole film is a film that wants to give an audience of today a feeling of it's always important, always necessary to take action and to reflect what's going on in our countries, in our continent, and even in the world. That sounds a bit naive as well, but this is what I truly believe. A story about the past, about this particular moment in history, should make especially a young audience feel like not only resistance, but reflecting the world's politic is always a good thing, even though as an individual, you sometimes feel like overwhelmed and you don't know what to do and how to find your voice, but it's always worth trying to find your voice.
It is indeed the case that in the foreground of the film is the story about the two young men, one German, one British. They knew each other at Oxford. They're now in key positions within their own governments as young civil servants. The German is opposed to Hitler. And I just wonder, did it please you to portray such brave German patriots who were revolted by what Hitler was doing to their country?
That's a tricky question because, as you might guess, it's very difficult as a German to make a film about this period of time. And, I didn't want to end up having the German lead character being the hero of the story, because I don't want me and my people feel better by, portraying someone who opposes. And I find the character that Robert Harris invented quite fascinating, because when we enter the story in 1932, Paul von Hartmann, as a young man, as a student, he's like in love with Hitler, and he believes in the new atmosphere, in the new, the change of mood in Germany, and we see the fire in his eyes. And then when we meet him back in 1938, we realize, okay, something has changed. But I tried to show him in a way that is not heroic. And the answer to why has he changed his mind comes very late in the film. I don't want to spoil it right now.
No, please don't.
So you asked me if it pleased me. No, because, in my own personal family history, in most of from everybody's family in Germany, we have had Nazis in our families. So it's not that I want to want to create a character to make me feel better. Not at all.
That's a wonderfully thoughtful answer, if I may say so. The movie is called Munich, The Edge of War. Its director is Christian Schwochow. Thank you so much, Christian, for coming on Times Radio this evening to talk about your very interesting film.
Thank you very much.
This is Michael Portillo on Times Radio.